The world is standing on the edge of a geopolitical knife, and what is unfolding right now in the Middle East is not just another cycle of tension. It is being described by insiders as a potential breaking point for the entire global order. According to a former senior military voice, the situation surrounding the Strait of Hormuz is rapidly evolving from a controlled standoff into something far more volatile, where miscalculation could trigger consequences no one is truly prepared for. At the center of this storm is a narrow but strategically irreplaceable waterway through which a massive share of the world's oil supply flows every single day. Whoever influences or disrupts this corridor doesn't just affect regional politics, they shake the foundation of the global economy itself. What makes the current moment so dangerous is not just military activity, but the psychological state of escalation on all sides. Public statements from leadership in Washington suggest absolute control and overwhelming force, yet beneath that confidence is a growing concern that the reality on the ground is far more complicated. The claim being made by the analyst is that the United States, despite its unmatched global military presence, is confronting a type of warfare environment. It is not fully optimized for particularly asymmetric naval threats like mines, drones, and precision missiles that can neutralize traditional advantages. In this environment, even the most powerful fleet can find itself constrained, not by lack of strength, but by the nature of the battlefield itself. Meanwhile, Iran is portrayed not as a passive actor reacting to pressure, but as a calculated strategist adapting to long-term confrontation. Instead of being intimidated into submission, it is described as having internalized the breakdown of diplomacy and shifted into a posture of preparation, endurance, and controlled escalation. From this perspective, every sanction, every naval deployment, and every political ultimatum becomes not a deterrent, but data information used to refine response strategies. The most alarming implication is that both sides may already be locked into a trajectory where de-escalation becomes politically and psychologically harder than escalation. Leaders who issue strong public threats risk trapping themselves in their own narratives, where backing down could be interpreted as weakness and escalation becomes the default path simply to maintain credibility. This creates a dangerous feedback loop where rhetoric drives action and action justifies further rhetoric. At the same time, the broader international system is not insulated from these dynamics. Global trade, energy pricing, and agricultural supply chains are already showing sensitivity to instability in the Gulf region. Fertilizer shortages, rising fuel costs, and supply chain disruptions are not theoretical risks. They are early signals of systemic stress. Countries far removed from the conflict zone are beginning to feel indirect pressure in the form of inflation and resource scarcity, meaning this is no longer a regional issue, but a global one. And yet, despite these warning signs, the trajectory appears to be moving toward further confrontation rather than compromise. The possibility of a diplomatic off-ramp still exists in theory, but it is increasingly constrained by political commitments, alliance structures, and domestic expectations. In such an environment, even rational solutions become difficult to implement because they conflict with established narratives of strength and resolve. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the convergence of military uncertainty, political rigidity, and economic vulnerability all at once. Each factor alone would be manageable, but together they create a system under stress where small events could trigger disproportionate reactions. And in such a system, control is not guaranteed by capability alone. It depends on restraint, communication, and the ability to step back from escalation paths that may already be in motion. As the situation deepens, the narrative shifts from a simple regional confrontation into a far more unsettling question of who actually holds initiative and control in this unfolding crisis. From the perspective presented, Iran is no longer behaving like a state waiting for pressure to ease or diplomacy to resume. It is operating under the assumption that confrontation is already underway in slow motion. That psychological shift matters because once a nation stops expecting compromise, it stops structuring its strategy around avoiding conflict and starts structuring it around surviving and shaping it. In that state, every move from an opposing power is anticipated, analyzed, and integrated into long-term defensive and offensive planning. Meanwhile, Western political messaging continues to emphasize dominance, deterrence, and operational superiority. But critics argue that messaging is not the same as capability, and perception is not the same as control. In highly constrained environments like the Strait of Hormuz, even a technologically superior navy can face practical limitations if asymmetric threats such as mines, fast-moving small vessels, drones, and missile systems are deployed effectively. The concern raised is not that one side lacks power, but that the nature of modern warfare in this environment reduces the effectiveness of traditional superiority. At the same time, escalation signals from leadership add another layer of instability. When political figures set deadlines, issue ultimatums, or publicly declare conditions for military action, they create a timeline that may not align with operational reality. If those deadlines pass without the promised outcomes, credibility is weakened. If action is taken prematurely, escalation risk increases dramatically. This creates a narrowing corridor of decision-making where options shrink over time, not because of external constraints alone, but because of internal political commitments. Economically, the pressure continues to build in parallel with military tensions. Energy markets react instantly to perceived instability in maritime choke points, and even minor disruptions can lead to rapid price fluctuations across global supply chains. The impact is not confined to oil importing nations. It extends into agriculture, transportation, manufacturing, and food production systems worldwide. Fertilizer availability, in particular, becomes a critical pressure point because it directly affects food output in large populations across the global south. As prices rise and availability tightens, the consequences begin to move from macroeconomic indicators into everyday life. Higher food costs, rationing pressures, and increased strain on governments already dealing with economic fragility. This is where the conflict stops being abstract and becomes tangible for millions of people who are not directly involved in the geopolitical struggle. At the strategic level, the argument being made is that the United States faces a narrowing set of options. Full-scale escalation carries significant risk. Limited engagement may fail to achieve objectives, and disengagement could be interpreted as retreat. This triangle of constrained choices is what makes the situation particularly unstable because it increases the likelihood of decisions being driven by momentum rather than design. Once momentum takes over, events begin to shape strategy instead of strategy shaping events. And in that environment, even small miscalculations, an intercepted vessel, a misfired strike, a misread intelligence report can escalate far beyond their original scope. The broader implication is that the world is entering a phase where traditional assumptions about power projection may no longer hold in the same way. Military dominance does not automatically translate into operational control in every environment, especially in geographically narrow and heavily contested regions. As this gap between capability and control becomes more visible, it introduces uncertainty not only for the actors directly involved, but for the entire global system that depends on stability in key maritime corridors. At this stage of the crisis, the focus shifts from political messaging to raw strategic reality, and the picture being painted is far more constrained than public statements suggest. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a symbolic flashpoint, it is a physical bottleneck through which a significant portion of global energy flows, meaning any disruption immediately translates into global economic shockwaves. The argument being made is that in such a narrow and contested environment, traditional naval superiority does not guarantee operational control. Even the most advanced fleet becomes vulnerable when the battle space is shaped by asymmetrical tools like naval mines, unmanned systems, and long-range precision strikes that do not require direct confrontation to be effective. In this scenario, control is not about occupying territory in the traditional sense, but about sustaining uninterrupted movement through a corridor that can be disrupted with relatively low-cost methods. That imbalance between cost of disruption and cost of response is what makes the situation strategically unstable. On one side, there is a superpower projecting force across a vast distance, relying on high-value assets such as aircraft carriers and destroyers. On the other side, there is a state positioned within range of the operational theater, capable of applying pressure in ways that are difficult to fully neutralize without escalation. This creates what analysts describe as a structural asymmetry. One side has overwhelming power, but the other side has geographic and tactical leverage. And in such conditions, leverage can sometimes matter more than raw strength. The concern raised is that confidence in technological superiority may lead to underestimating the complexity of mine warfare and maritime denial strategies, which historically have proven far more disruptive than expected in constrained waterways. Clearing such threats is slow, methodical, and vulnerable work, often requiring coordination, specialized equipment, and time, three things that are in short supply during rapid escalation. Meanwhile, political leadership may project certainty and control, but operational reality moves at a different pace. Decisions made at the strategic level can collide with logistical limitations at the tactical level, creating gaps between intent and execution. It is within these gaps that escalation risks increase because uncertainty forces actors to compensate with more aggressive signaling or preemptive action. Economically, this maritime pressure point has global consequences that extend far beyond the region. Energy markets react not only to actual disruptions, but to perceived risk, meaning that volatility can spike even without full closure of the waterway. Insurance costs rise, shipping routes adjust, supply chains become less efficient, and inflationary pressure spreads outward. In a highly interconnected global economy, even partial instability in a key choke point can produce ripple effects that reach households thousands of miles away. This is why the situation is not being viewed as a contained regional conflict, but as a potential systemic shock. At the same time, the political narrative surrounding the crisis becomes increasingly rigid. Public declarations, threats, and red lines create expectations that narrow future decision space. Once those lines are drawn publicly, reversing them becomes politically costly, even if conditions change on the ground. This is how strategic flexibility erodes over time, not necessarily through defeat, but through accumulated commitments that limit future options. As a result, the system begins to drift toward outcomes that are not fully designed by any single actor, but rather emerge from the interaction of constraints, pressures, and reactions. And in that kind of environment, control becomes less about intention and more about adaptability under stress. As the escalation continues to unfold, the most unsettling layer of the situation is not just military tension, but the growing sense that decision making is being pulled away from rational strategy and toward momentum driven escalation. At this point, the conflict is no longer being framed as a simple contest of power. It is being described as a system where each move reduces future flexibility. Once commitments are made publicly, especially through strong statements, deadlines, or threats, they begin to act like anchors on future policy. Leaders are then forced into a narrowing corridor of choices where backing down risks appearing weak, while escalating risks triggering a broader conflict that may be difficult to contain. This dynamic creates what can be described as a psychological trap in high-level decision-making. The fear of losing credibility begins to compete with the logic of strategic restraint. In such conditions, even actors who prefer de-escalation may find themselves pulled toward escalation simply because alternative options become politically costly or rhetorically inconsistent. At the same time, the opposing side is not passive in this equation. Iran is portrayed as operating with a long-term defensive mindset, absorbing pressure and preparing responses rather than reacting impulsively to every provocation. This creates an asymmetry not only in military terms, but in time horizons. One side may operate on short political cycles, while the other plans across extended conflict durations. That difference in pacing can significantly affect how each side interprets the other's actions. What one side sees as pressure, the other may see as expected behavior within a prolonged confrontation. Economically, the consequences of this sustained tension continue to expand outward. Global markets respond not just to physical disruptions, but to the anticipation of disruption. Energy prices fluctuate, shipping routes become more expensive, and investment uncertainty increases. Over time, these effects compound, feeding into inflationary trends that affect everything from industrial production to household costs. The interconnected nature of modern supply chains means that instability in a single maritime corridor can propagate through multiple sectors simultaneously, amplifying the overall impact. Meanwhile, military uncertainty adds another layer of instability. In environments where precision weapons, drones, and asymmetric tactics are widely available, traditional assumptions about control and deterrence become less reliable. The presence of such technologies reduces the predictability of escalation outcomes because small tactical actions can have disproportionately large strategic consequences. This increases the risk of misinterpretation, where one side reads a defensive move as offensive preparation, or vice versa. Once that misinterpretation occurs, escalation can accelerate faster than diplomatic channels can respond. Politically, the situation is further complicated by external influences, alliances, and domestic pressures. Decision makers are not operating in isolation. They are responding to internal political expectations, international partnerships, and strategic commitments that constrain their freedom of action. This creates a multi-layered decision environment where every option carries trade-offs not only in military terms, but also in political legitimacy and alliance stability. As a result, even when de-escalation pathways exist in theory, they may not be politically feasible in practice. The deeper concern expressed is that the system is gradually moving from intentional control toward reactive behavior. Instead of shaping events, leaders may increasingly find themselves responding to events already in motion. In such a scenario, the risk is not necessarily a single catastrophic decision, but a chain reaction of smaller decisions that cumulatively lead to a far larger outcome than any actor originally intended. As the scenario continues to unfold, the tone shifts from tactical analysis to a far more strategic and systemic warning about what prolonged escalation could mean for the global order. At this point, the conflict is no longer being framed as a localized confrontation in the Middle East, but as a stress test for the entire architecture of international power, energy dependence, and economic stability. One of the most emphasized points is that modern global systems are deeply interconnected, meaning that disruption in a single maritime choke point can cascade outward into energy markets, food systems, and financial structures across multiple continents. The Strait of Hormuz, in this framing, becomes less of a regional flashpoint and more of a global pressure valve, one that, if constricted, sends shockwaves through nearly every major economy simultaneously. This is where the discussion moves into economic vulnerability. Rising energy costs are not just abstract numbers on trading screens. They translate into transportation costs, manufacturing expenses, and ultimately consumer prices. When fuel becomes more expensive, everything that depends on it becomes more expensive, creating inflationary pressure that spreads across sectors. At the same time, supply chain disruptions in critical inputs like fertilizer begin to affect agricultural output, which then feeds into food prices. This creates a multi-layered inflation effect where energy, agriculture, and logistics all reinforce one another. The result is not just temporary volatility, but a sustained strain on global economic stability. In parallel, the discussion turns toward shifting global power dynamics. As traditional energy routes become less stable, countries that can secure alternative energy sources, maintain domestic production, or diversify supply chains gain relative advantage. This is where rising powers and strategic competitors are seen as benefiting indirectly from instability in established systems. The argument is not necessarily that these actors create the instability, but that they are positioned to adapt more effectively to it. In contrast, economies heavily dependent on stable global trade flows face greater vulnerability when those flows are disrupted. Militarily, the critique becomes even more pointed. There is a growing concern that reliance on legacy force projection models such as large naval formations, long-range air power, and expeditionary deployments may not fully account for the realities of modern asymmetric warfare. Technologies like precision-guided missiles, drones, and naval mines reduce the predictability of engagement outcomes, especially in geographically constrained environments. This creates